Hey y'all, this is Darren Van Dam, and welcome back to Flick Connection, where in less time than you normally spend scrolling for something to watch, I'm going to tell you about 20 movies included right here on YouTube that you can watch for free. And no, these aren't going to be just some crap movies. YouTube actually has a bunch of premium movies you can watch for free, movies like these right here, but instead of talking about these, I'm going to tell you about 20 movies that you've likely never heard of, starting with my number 20 pick, Chaos Theory. This is a lower budget drama starring Ryan Reynolds that's got a very interesting twist. He plays kind of an average guy and everything seems to be going wrong on his life, so he decides to totally throw caution to the wind. So he starts doing these things, these little note cards tell him, and it just takes his life into a kind of a wild direction. Now obviously Ryan Reynolds carries this thing. I don't know that the movie would have been nearly as interesting without him, but even though it's a fairly low budget effort from him, it's surprisingly good. And even though it's not a rom-com, really in any sense of the word, I do think it will appeal to fans of romantic comedies, and people who don't like them as well. Now next up, we've got a movie that has some bigger names in it, but it's actually a remake of a much smaller movie titled 13 Sins. The remake is free on YouTube right now. It's titled Nerve. And as far as remakes go, this one's pretty decent. They actually toned it down a little bit to give it a PG-13 rating. It's not nearly as off-putting as 13 Sins, but you've got a bigger cast with Emma Roberts and Dave Franco. And they're actually playing this elaborate game of truth or dare where they're having to do these outrageous tasks in order to win money, yet the tasks keep ramping up, and the story actually does a good job of explaining why they would continue to do such dangerous things. It's got a cool, glossy look to it, and if you're the least bit interested in the setup, then Nerve definitely delivers. Next up on the list, we've got one starring Margot Robbie that is got the same sort of electric neon vibe that Nerve had in Terminal. Now this is a weird one. It's not really glued together perfectly, which is why a lot of you probably haven't heard of it, but for a lower budget Margot Robbie sort of espionage thriller, this is a pretty cool flick. I will admit they go for style over substance here. This is not a highly rated movie, but if you're into the style and the vibe, then this is a pretty cool flick. She is great as always, but you've also got Simon Pegg in this movie, a small role for Mike Myers actually, and this is one of those movies that's less than the sum of its parts, meaning it's got a lot of really fantastic parts, and the movie itself just doesn't quite deliver, but considering the fact that it's got so many great elements in it, it's still a pretty solid watch. Alright, we're going to go back almost 30 years for my next pick to 1996. Yes, 1996. It's almost 30 years ago, but Albino Alligator is probably one of the lesser known movies on a list of hidden gems, despite the fact that it stars Matt Dillon, Faye Dunaway, and Gary Sinise, and was directed by Kevin Spacey. After a robbery gone wrong, some thieves meet at a bar that ends up being full of New Orleans police. And the entire movie takes place in or around this one single bar. It plays out kind of like a one-act play, but it's a fantastic, tense movie. Plenty of tension throughout this thing, especially considering it's all in this one bar room. Top-notch performances from everyone involved, even the supporting cast is killer in this. It does feel old-fashioned, so if you're the least bit interested in it, I think you'll be totally surprised you've never seen Albino Alligator.
See, what they do is they send them out in the open, just waiting to get them killed. Because when some rival group of gators shows themselves in the open killing the elbow gator, they surround and kill their rivals.
Now this is a list of underrated movies, and my next pick is probably one of the most known movies on this list, or at least it was fairly popular back when it initially released, and time is sorely forgotten, Don't Say a Word, starring Brittany Murphy. Now Michael Douglas is really the star of this, but I say Brittany Murphy because she absolutely steals the show in this movie. This is one of the last great performances of her before she died, and it's a killer one. Now this is kind of a formulaic thriller. It will feel fairly familiar if you've never seen it, but it's still top-notch stuff with amazing performances and a really interesting twist at its core. When Douglas's daughter is kidnapped, he's actually got to go to this very troubled woman, played by Brittany Murphy, to find out what sort of secret she knows in order to get his daughter back. So it's a setup that you don't see in many other movies, and it works quite well here, surprisingly so. This is a top shelf thriller that just, again, time is completely forgotten about, and it's just hanging out for free on YouTube. Next up, I've got one of the last really cool movies that John Cusack starred in. He's gone on to do a lot of straight-to-streaming things, but before he went down that road, he was in The Raven. In this movie, he actually plays Edgar Allan Poe. Now, this movie has a lot in common with the Netflix original, The Pale Blue Eye, starring Christian Bale, but I actually think this one's more successful in terms of storytelling. As I said, Cusack plays Edgar Allan Poe, and someone starts committing murders based on the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, so a detective teams up with him to solve these murders. So you get a pretty killer murder mystery here, laced with Edgar Allan Poe stories, which is not what you got with The Pale Blue Eye. That one was a little more slow-paced, felt a little bit more authentic, whereas this feels a little bit more like a big-budget movie. Now, for some reason, a lot of rappers turn into actors, more so than any other performing arts, it seems, but one of my all-time favorite rappers to become an actor, or rather, the one that became maybe one of the best actors, I think, was Mos Def. Now, he's not really done movies for about 10 years, but one of my favorites that he did was with Bruce Willis, titled 16 Blocks.
You put the Hawaii 5-0 light on and use your police power. Make a hole, make a hole.
Now, this is kind of a straightforward Bruce Willis action flick. The only difference is he's playing kind of a grizzled cop here, but Mos Def actually plays a fantastic character, and that's one of the reasons I always liked him, is he never really plays a straightforward character. There's always something a little different or off about him, and he does a great job making that work. And you get that with 16 Blocks. You also get some decent action, some police corruption. It's not a big knockdown, drag-out, over-the-top action movie, but it's got plenty of interesting elements to it. So if you're a fan of Willis or Mos Def, or even just kind of 90s to early 2000s mid-budget action movies like this, and 16 Blocks is a total gem. Now, another mid-budget action movie with a, I guess we'll call him a rapper turned actor, is The Big Hit, starring Mark Wahlberg. Now, Mark Wahlberg, this is one of his first big or mid-budget movies, and he's good, but Lou Diamond Phillips absolutely steals the show. He's amazing in this movie. He gets a ton of screen time. It's one of my favorite roles of his. In fact, the entire cast is really fun to watch. Christina Applegate is in this, Bokeem Woodbine, who is in a ton of stuff now. He's fantastic in this as well. This is just kind of a wild, fun crime caper movie. There's plenty of action in it, but you're really just following thieves on heists. It's cool stuff, even if it feels really dated. It's kind of got that 90s vibe in almost the best way possible. Now, if you're a fan of professional wrestling, or you've got maybe a family with some slightly older kids than me, mine are 7 and 5, I recommend highly Fighting with My Family.
You really want to choke her out in a lot of fingers? Yeah. Now pull it tight. Oh, yeah, now she's in trouble.
Now, this is actually based on a true story, but it's about a family of people who just love wrestling, and 2 of the kids try to become professional wrestlers as they get older. Florence Pugh is the lead here. They did market this movie as starring The Rock, but in actuality, he produced it, and he's in 2 scenes, basically as a cameo to try to help sell the movie. So don't expect to see him much in the movie, but who you can see is Vince Vaughn. He actually plays the coach in this movie and does a fantastic job. He's funny when he needs to be, he's insightful when he needs to be. It's a great character that went sort of unnoticed, I think, in this movie, but Florence Pugh is always great, and there are some family dynamics in this movie that are particularly well done and well presented for a movie like this. And then one to not watch with the family is a Jason Statham remake that I think is just top-notch, The Mechanic. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the original Charles Bronson Mechanic. It's one of my favorite Charles Bronson movies, actually. So when this remake came out, I was skeptical, but I actually really liked it. Now, I do think the sequel that Statham did is hilariously bad, but This original is pretty slick and is a fairly decent representation of the original. It actually tells the story in almost the same fashion with some modern day updates. Ben Foster is fantastic in this movie per usual, so this is one I recommend. If you love the original like me and you just did not want to have your heart broken by a remake, I'm telling you, this one is solid. But even if you haven't seen the original, you can check out the Jason Statham version and be thoroughly entertained. Now, that was my bottom 10. Before we get on to the top 10, if you want to get a shirt like this, I've got a bunch over at my new store, darrenvandam.com/shop. There's a link in the video description, but it's real easy to find. My wife and I designed all of these together. I did most of the concepts and artwork, and then she did just a killer job turning these into beautiful t-shirt designs. They're colorful, highly detailed, they're 100% cotton, and it's not that rough cotton either. These are insanely soft. They do shrink a little bit, so you may want to get a size up depending on how you like your shirts to fit. But we've got hoodies, cups, some of the designs are limited edition, so if you see one you like, you might want to grab it sooner than later. But speaking of stuff you might want to do, why don't we just talk about the top 10 movies on this list. But now we'll go all the way back to 1978 with a Michael Caine sci-fi flick that scared the crap out of me as a kid, The Swarm. Now this is a B movie in more ways than one. It's got fairly low ratings, it's cheesy, doesn't make a ton of sense, but if you want to watch kind of a funky, cool 70s flick about killer bees, this would be the one to watch. There's actually a giant swarm of Africanized killer bees moving across America, going from city to city. It's kind of an attempt to do something like Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, but it's sillier and cheesier. In fact, I would say this lives somewhere between Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds and Attack of the Killer Tomatoes.
It is more than speculation. It is a prediction. The swarm is coming.
Next up, we've got an unrated action assassin movie from South Korea titled A Company Man. Now this one is about this large company that employs assassins around the world, which is something I've seen before. None of that is mind-blowing, but the presentation of the company and sort of this guy's mundane life as an assassin is unique. In fact, I've seen quite a few contract-killing companies in movies over the past several decades, and the presentation of A Company Man is one of my favorites because it feels not just the most realistic, but it feels the closest to what it's like to work for a big company in a cubicle. And it's actually got some really good commentary on, working for big companies like that, while also being packed with some really fantastic action and fight choreography. Now, this is from South Korea, and it's not on Netflix, which means there's not really going to be a dubbed version. You're going to have to read subtitles, but if that doesn't bother you and you want to see some killer action, A Company Man is top-notch stuff. Speaking of getting some action, my next pick is actually a cult classic romantic comedy. There are not many of those. The Girl Next Door.
Oh my, she's so hot.
What channel, dude?
Dude, what the?
In this movie, Emil Hirsch plays a teenage boy who discovers an ex-porn star has moved in next door. They meet, fall in love, the supporting cast is great. One of his friends is played by Paul Dano in this movie. Timothy Olyphant is kind of the bad guy in the movie. They're all great, and that is what makes this movie still work today. On the surface, it seems like a silly teen sex comedy. Those are a dime a dozen. And The Girl Next Door is that, but all of the ingredients and elements are just top-notch. It's funny, it's heartwarming, and again, the characters and performances are all way better than you would normally get from a movie like this. Way better. Okay, my next one is kind of an odd pick. It's a classic movie. It has held up with time with a very small audience. It stars Peter Sellers, total legend, and it's one of his more legendary performances in Being There. Now, stick with me, this is a slow-paced flick, but if you like the setup and the joke, then I'm telling you, the humor in this movie is gonna kill you. Peter Sellers actually plays a gardener with very limited mental capacity. I don't know where he is on the spectrum, but it's way down the line. But he dresses well and he doesn't say much, and people around him begin to suspect that he's actually this brilliant thinker. Now, this is kind of a phenomenon you've maybe seen in real life happen before, maybe even on the news, and it's brought to life and being there in such a fantastic way. Peter Sellers has done some of the greatest satirical films of all time, and being there is right up there with movies like Dr. Strangelove in terms of how sharply it delivers its joke and overall message. Next up, we've got Antonio Banderas starring in a loose remake of Beowulf. It is titled The 13th Warrior. Now, this is actually based on a book by Michael Crichton, the same author as Jurassic Park. His book was titled Eaters of the Dead. And The 13th Warrior, again, is pretty much based on that book, and that book is a loose interpretation or retelling of Beowulf. And rather than a lot of supernatural elements, it is more of these tribal people perceiving supernatural elements, yet the story itself is much more grounded. Yet this is a fantastic action-adventure movie from the late 90s. And another reason this is just a total gem of a recommendation is I don't see it available on streaming services often. It's on YouTube right now, and when it leaves, which it will eventually, there's a very good chance I'm not going to see it again anywhere for quite a while. Martin Scorsese has a pick on this list, and it's one of his more odd De Niro movies, The King of Comedy. Now, if you don't know, Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro collaborated for almost 2 decades, making some of the greatest films of all time. And while The King of Comedy is not one of those films, it is still top-notch stuff. In fact, the plot of Joker with Joaquin Phoenix is loosely based on this storyline. Yet in The King of Comedy, you get a lot more humor. It's not nearly as dark, yet it does go to some of those dark places. Robert De Niro is fantastic in this movie. He's playing a really funny character, but he's also incredibly troubled, and it's a very different character than you've probably ever seen Robert De Niro play. Jerry Lewis plays a talk show host, kind of a Johnny Carson type character, and the story has a lot to do with fame and the way people react to fame and being around it. It's top-notch stuff. It's coming from a master filmmaker. It's funny, and it's also this wild, compelling sort of caper of a story.
What's the matter with you?
Mom!
Take it easy. Lower it.
I'm not gonna lower it. I have to do this now.
I don't mind you playing it, but lower it.
De Niro is also featured in my next pick, but Copland actually features Sylvester Stallone as the lead, and it's one of his greatest performances outside of Rocky. He actually put on quite a bit of weight for this movie, and not only is Stallone fantastic, but you've also got Ray Liotta, Harvey Keitel, Michael Rappaport, Robert Patrick, and a lot of classic gangster movie faces you're going to recognize. If you're fans of those folks in these types of movies, Copland is a top-notch one, especially for when it came out in the late 90s. It's on the heels of so many classic gangster movies, yet this deals much more with police corruption and is just a dynamite film. My number 3 pick on this list is also the most visually stunning movie on this list, and honestly, one of the most visually stunning movies I've ever seen, Jet Li's Hero. This director would go on to do The House of Flying Daggers, 2 movies that I consider to be miles better than the more popular Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Quentin Tarantino actually played a big role in getting this released in the US back in the early 2000s. You'll notice right away these rich monochromatic color palettes, and that's because the setup for this movie is Jet Li is this warrior going to the king to explain how he did away with these other 3 warriors. And each of the 3 stories he tells is done in this different, unique color palette, and the storytelling here is just absolutely breathtaking. Jet Li has done some amazing movies over the years, but this one, even though it's 20 years old, I think still might be my favorite. Now, the way I put these lists together, sometimes there's some coincidences. It's just chance. I genuinely rank these in the way that I want, and my top 2 picks are both highly underrated Matt Damon movies. My number 2 pick being The Rainmaker. Now, this is based on a book by the same name, written by John Grisham, who has written some of the greatest courtroom dramas in history. And this movie's directed by Francis Ford Coppola. You get an incredible but small role from Mickey Rourke in this movie. Danny DeVito is amazing. Jon Voight, Claire Danes, Virginia Madsen. There's a lot of high drama in this outside of the courtroom, but this is also one of those great courtroom dramas where the climax of the movie takes place in the courtroom and is actually kind of a long sequence towards the end of the film, and it's all incredible. If you like this genre and somehow you've either never seen The Rainmaker or maybe it's just been a long time since you've seen it, it's honestly one of the best courtroom dramas made since To Kill a Mockingbird. And then my number one pick is wildly popular, still to this day, but still I think is not respected as the just solid flick that it is, Rounders.
Bad judgment, but don't you worry, son. It will all be over soon.
Now, I know a bunch of you watching probably love this movie and have seen it quite a few times over the years, but to me, this still seems largely disregarded in Matt Damon's filmography and Edward Norton's, mainly because they've done so many killer flicks, but Rounders is certainly one of them. Not only are they both great, you get an incredible little role from John Turturro and John Malkovich. And yes, it's about poker players, and you get a good poker player movie, but it also ends up being about so much more and does a great job of relating his life to the game of poker in kind of a seamless way that allows you to be thoroughly entertained by this movie without it really feeling like it's holding your hand or pandering to you. It's just top-notch, well-rounded stuff. If you've never seen it, make it the first one you watch off of this list, but make sure to catch these titles before they leave YouTube. Don't forget to visit DarrenVanDam.com to check out the new shirt designs over there. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special YouTube episode, and you will see me on the next one.